This is the Homestead Journey Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the pursuit of self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and sustainability. This is episode number 105 of the Homestead Journey Podcast. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me here on the Homestead Journey. My name is Brian Wells. I am coming to you from 3B Farm and Homestead here in beautiful but rainy upstate New York. Folks, it has been an absolutely beautiful, warm fall up to this point, but they're saying, like in everything, all good things must come to an end. And this coming week, we are supposed to start getting more of that fallish weather, those cooler days and certainly cooler nights. And I'm looking forward to it, I must admit. Let's jump on over to this week's Homestead Happenings, and I will bring you up to speed with what we've been doing here on the homestead. Let me jump back to last Sunday. As you may recall from last week's episode, I recorded it on Saturday evening, and I told you I would let you know how things went with making the turkey broth. I was going to try to make it 3 different ways. I tried making some in a stock pot. I tried making some in a pressure canner, a pressure cooker in essence, and I tried some in our Oster roasting pan. So how did it all turn out? Well, the stuff that I made in the stock pot, for some reason, it just didn't have a lot of turkey flavor. It tasted more like the aromatics. The stuff that came out in the pressure cooker, it was phenomenal. And the stuff in the roasting pan, it was just okay. So what I ended up doing is I actually discarded the stock from the stock pot, which in hindsight probably wasn't the smartest thing for me to do, but that's what I chose to do. And I combined the broth from the pressure cooker and the roasting pan, and I let them just cook down and reduce. And that really yielded a very, very tasty broth. So I was definitely very happy with the final product, but certainly there are a few things that I would do differently next time. First of all, I started with raw carcasses. I had parted them out for my mom and dad. Hindsight being what it is, I should have roasted them in the oven or in the roasting pan for a bit before making the stock. So if I could do it over again, that certainly would be one thing I would do differently. Secondly, especially in the stock pot, I put far too much water. And so I think that is why I ended up with a broth that tasted more like the aromatics than it did like turkey. Between the fact that I had so much water and that the turkey had not been roasted, I think that really lent itself to a bit of a flavorless broth. Now, in the past, when I've made chicken broth, I have used just raw chicken that I have cooked down. And it's worked out well, which is why I tried that route with the turkey carcasses. But when I've made turkey broth in the past, I have used turkey carcasses that were left over after we had roasted the turkey. And certainly, the broth that I've made in the past was a lot more flavorful right from the get-go than this broth was. And so in the future, if I attempt this again, which I think I will certainly start by roasting the carcass and not just starting with a raw turkey carcass. Speaking of the turkey broth, I had a bit of a mishap on Friday. Now, thank God it wasn't any worse than what it was. Those of you who are members of the Supporting Listeners program, you've already seen pictures of my injuries. Well, not the full-on injuries, but the bandages. but certainly things could have been much worse than what they were. Earlier in the evening on Friday, my mom and dad had stopped by, and I had run downstairs to grab the turkey, or at least some of the turkey, out of the freezer for them to take home. And in doing so, I knocked a broom off of the broom holder that we have in the stairwell. And I forgot that I had done so. And after they left, I boxed up the broth that we were going to keep, and I went to take it downstairs. And of course, I've got a case of broth in my hand, so I can't really see very well. And I tripped over that broom and went headfirst down the steps. Now, thankfully, it was down towards the bottom of the steps. I think it was probably 3 or 4 steps up from the bottom. But I went headfirst, holding the broth. And next thing I knew, I was on the ground and I was wet because jars had broken and broth had splashed up on me. And I was kind of a little bit disheveled and disoriented, and I wasn't quite sure what had happened. I didn't hit my head, but it was just one of those things that had happened so fast. And then you're trying to assess the situation. Have I broken anything? Have I cut myself? How bad is it? And of course, my wife and son, they came running. And when it was all said and done, I think I lost 3 or 4 jars of broth, smashed the jars, and I cut my hand up pretty good. My mom and dad had just left. My mom is an LPN, and so I called them and I asked them to come back. Of course, they came back in a panic, but I just wanted to have my mom assess one cut that was rather deep to see whether or not she thought I should go get it looked at and maybe have some stitches put in. Long story short, we decided that steri stripping it probably was all that needed to be done. And so far, so good. We threw some Neosporin on it, and I'm back in business. A little sore. I banged my elbows and wrists, and I certainly don't bounce quite as good as I did 20 years ago. But for me, besides the fact that my pride was injured, I was more upset about the fact that I broke canning jars and I wasted good food. That made me very, very upset. But all's well that ends well. Thankfully, it wasn't any worse. And it certainly put the kibosh on what I was trying to get done on Friday. You see, I was planning on putting away all of the canned goods that I've kind of been amassing over the summer. I had taken some down earlier in the summer, but I really just had jars sitting around everywhere because my least favorite part of canning is putting it away, because when you put it away, you really should pull the stuff that you have on the shelf out so that you're rotating stock. And that's something that I just don't like to do. It's fiddly. And I just don't like fiddly things. And so if I can come up with an excuse not to do something fiddly, I'm going to come up with an excuse not to do something fiddly. But I had finally kind of decided that it was going to be the day I was going to do it. I was going to get those canned goods put away. And most of them get put down in our basement in a big canning cupboard. And so I finally had kind of gotten to that spot where it was going to get done. And then I took that header down the stairs and ended up on the couch for the rest of the evening. But yesterday, so I'm recording this Sunday evening. Yesterday was Saturday. Yesterday evening, I finally did take the plunge and get the rest of those things done. And so all of our canned goods up to this point, and I'm pretty sure the vast majority of my canning is done for the season. There's not much else going on in the garden. I don't really need applesauce. We have applesauce. We have apple butter left from last year. So I don't think I'm going to do any of that up. May try to get some apples and do some apple slices. But I'm not going to be doing any canning of chicken. And right now, beef is so obscenely expensive that unless I find a great deal on beef somewhere, I'm certainly not going to be canning any beef this fall. So probably the canning season for me is just about done. And so anyhow, it was good to get those jars put away the stock rotated, and we will look forward to enjoying that food throughout the winter. Yesterday, Bonnie and I actually left the homestead for the bulk of the day and went and did some leaf peeping down in the Catskills. We are just so blessed to live in such a beautiful state. When I talk about beautiful upstate New York, folks, it's not just a shtick. It's not just a catchphrase for me. I absolutely love upstate New York. And I love the state of New York. The state of New York is just absolutely beautiful, from the North Country out to the western part, the central region of New York, certainly upstate New York, the Catskills, the southern tier, downstate, maybe not quite so much. Those of us who live upstate kind of have this love-hate relationship with the city. And certainly Long Island is in a totally different category of its own. My vote would be to give Long Island and New York City to New Jersey, and we'd be done with it. But anyhow, we went down to the Catskills, and it was just absolutely beautiful. It was a great day. The colors weren't as vibrant as in years past, but we have not had a frost yet. And really getting that frost is what causes those leaves to be a little bit more vibrant in color. But we enjoyed what we could, what was there. And it was just a great day hanging out with my wife and taking some time away from the pressures of the homestead. The last thing I wanted to share with you is one of the other things that's kind of a fiddly thing for me. I should say fiddly. It's probably me just giving a bad excuse. I am not great about keeping my garage neat and tidy. I go from project to project, season to season, and things just never really get put away like I should. And so I had chicken gear from when we started chickens out back in the spring that I still hadn't put away. I had the Ohio brooders still there. My seed starting trays and so forth were still stacked there. And it was kind of, as you started at the back of the garage, it was kind of like the earlier spring, and then moved towards the garage door. It was kind of a tour throughout the season of homesteading. And so this afternoon, my son and I took a crack at that bay of the garage and really got that tidied up. Now, the other side of the garage still looks like a bomb went off. And that's a lot of tools that I got from a friend of mine who moved to California back in February. And I just have not organized that area of the garage yet. And so hopefully next weekend, Brian, Jay, and I will be able to get that side of the garage kind of organized and tidied up. And then I'll be ready to destroy it all over again because that's just how I roll. But anyhow, that's what we've been up to here on 3B Farm and Homestead. I hope things are well wherever you are at. Before we head on over to this week's Charting the Course, I did want to make a bit of an announcement. And that is that here on the podcast, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of the Homestead Journey podcast. Can you believe that, folks? 2 years that we have been journeying together towards self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and sustainability. And so in the month of November, I am going to be putting together something that hopefully will help you help me as I kind of determine the path forward for the podcast, and as a means of me saying thank you for you helping me help you. I am going to be offering some fabulous prizes once again. And so keep an eye out on our social media accounts, and of course, listen to the podcast on a regular basis so you don't miss it. But I am putting together a survey, just some questions about some of the content that you might find helpful, maybe some ways that I need to tweak the podcast, things that maybe I should do away with, just ways that I can be of more help to you. And so that survey will be launching soon. Keep an eye out on our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram. And then what I will be doing is throughout the month of November, I will be drawing names each week for those of you who have taken part in the survey, and you will be entered to win fabulous, fabulous prizes. And so if you would consider taking part in that survey as we celebrate 2 years of the Homestead Journey podcast, I would greatly appreciate it. All right, let's head on over to this week's Charting the Course. This week's Charting the Course actually comes as the result of a conversation or a question, I guess, I had from a supporting listener by the name of Barb. Now, Barb reached out to me earlier this year with regards to buying a stove to do some outdoor canning. I don't exactly remember why Barb was looking into doing outdoor canning, but a lot of people look to do canning outdoors because they want to keep the mess outside during the summer. They don't want to have the heat and the humidity from a canner indoors, or they might have a glass top stove, which really is not conducive to heavy canners being placed on top of it. Whatever the reason, there are a lot of people who find the idea of canning outside to be an intriguing one. But there are certainly some things that you need to consider if that is something that you are thinking about doing. At the end of the day, I want to make sure that as you can, you are canning safely. And I mean that kind of in two ways, that you are doing it in a way where you're not going to have a canner tip over on you or a canner explode because it ran dry or whatever. And I also want to make sure that the food that you're processing is safe for you and your family to eat. So some things that you need to consider, and these are things that are kind of my observations, but also ideas that I have gleaned from two great sources, one of them being the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And I will provide a link to their article on outdoor canning in the show notes. And also the Penn State Extension has some great information on canning outdoors. And I will provide a link to an article that they also have on the web. So the first thing that you really should consider if you are thinking about canning outdoors is simply this: where are you going to do it? You want to make sure that where you're going to do it is an area that is level, that it is solid, and that it is an area that is really free from any kind of trip hazards. So, if you're thinking about, well, I'm going to set it up under a tree, but there are a bunch of roots around, that may not be the best place to do it in case you were to trip over a root and go headfirst into your canner. Now, I know that's a bit of maybe an extreme example, but you certainly want to make sure that wherever you're going to do this, it's an area that is level, that it is solid, and that it is free from any kind of hazards like that. Again, you're dealing with hot water, you're dealing with pressure canners that are pressurized, and I certainly don't want you to be injured because you are in an unsafe situation. You also want an area that is semi-protected. What do I mean by semi-protected? Well, you certainly don't want it out where it's going to be doused by the pouring rain. Or if you're going to can on a rainy day, you want to make sure you have an easy up. You also want to consider wind, because wind, not just the fact that it will blow out the flame, but it also can affect the temperature of your canner. And then that certainly can affect the safety of the food that you can. So again, consider where you're going to put it. You want to have it in an area that is solid, level, free from hazards, and is semi-protected. Now, some people will do it in their garage. Some people might do it on their back deck. Other people might use a sunroom, a sun porch. I've heard of people setting up kind of she sheds or canning sheds And all of those are certainly great and viable ideas. The second thing that you want to consider is how big are your canners? Your stove or your burner does need to be such that it can handle the weight that you are going to be putting on it. If you're doing a tabletop type portable propane stove or electric stove, then you obviously want to make sure that the table that you're putting that on is sturdy. It's not rickety. It's not going to collapse under the weight of the canner. And if you are buying something like a Camp Chef style stove with legs, then you definitely want to take a look at what it's rated for with regards to weight, because those canners certainly, when fully loaded, depending on the size of the canner, they can be very, very heavy. So definitely make sure that you are buying the right tool for the job. Also, the National Center for Food Preservation recommends that the burner diameter should be no more than 4 inches smaller than the diameter of your canner. This is just to make sure that you have an even heat and that when you bring things to pressure and temp, that you're doing so in a safe manner. Another thing that you're going to want to consider is that your canner should be centered over the burner. If you're buying an outside stove that has windscreens on it, those windscreens or windbreaks might interfere with you being able to center your canner over the burner if you have a very large canner. And so definitely check that out as well, just to make sure that you are doing things in a very, very safe manner. The third thing that you need to consider is what type of canning are you doing? Are you hot water bath canning or are you pressure canning? Water bath canners can handle a bit of a higher BTU. Simply put, the higher the BTU, the hotter the flame. Most canner manufacturers don't recommend that you use burners over 12,000 BTU. As I was doing some research into this, I got to thinking about our stove, and our stove has I can't remember what it's called, like a power burner or something like that. It's like a super burner. And so I went and looked up that. It actually is 20,000 BTU. And I got to keep that in mind because many times I have canned on that with a thing full bore. So I've got to back that puppy down to make sure that I am not too hot. But also read your manufacturer's instructions. The Penn State Extension advises that there are at least 2 manufacturers that don't recommend canning on portable burners. Now, they don't specify which manufacturers those are. I've heard tell that Miro is one of them, but certainly look at the documentation that came with your canner to find out whether or not they have that kind of a recommendation. The reason why the BTUs is important is because if you have a flame that's too hot on some of the lower end canners, not that there's anything wrong with those canners, but some of the lower end canners are very, very thin aluminum. And so if you have the BTUs too high, what's going to happen potentially is the bottom is going to warp. And not only that, but the water could evaporate too quickly and your canner could run dry. And that's certainly a very dangerous thing. So make sure that your manufacturer doesn't recommend against canning on a portable burner. And the other thing that the people at Penn State recommend, they do recommend that if you are using a portable stove, that you add a little extra water in the canner. So many times the manufacturer will say have 2 inches of water in the bottom of your canner. You might want to look at maybe having 2.5 or 3 inches of water in there, especially if you are doing things like meat or fish or chicken that take a long time to process. So with all of that said, then maybe your question is, well, what should I buy? Well, the first thing I'm going to tell you is what not to buy. And that is, do not buy a turkey fryer. A turkey fryer, while it is definitely something that is stable and should be able to handle the biggest of big pressure canners, the BTUs on a turkey fryer are simply far too high to be able to safely pressure can on them. You might be able to water bath can on them. I don't know if I would attempt it, but certainly a turkey fryer is not what I would buy if I am going to pressure can. Secondly, I will also tell you this, that I have a dual burner tabletop unit that I was given that came from Harbor Freight. It's no longer manufactured. So my only experience is with something like that sits on a tabletop. It's 2 burners. It's basically like a small stove. But many people have recommended the Camp Chef Explorer with a huge caveat, and that is that you should only ever use it on the low setting. The burners on that are 30,000 BTU. So if you had it on high, it would be far, far, far too hot for a pressure canner. But there are many people who claim that they use the Camp Chef Explorer on low and that it is acceptable as far as the heat from the flame. Finally, another idea that you might want to consider, depending on how you are setting this up, if you are setting this up in your garage or in a shed, then you might want to look at getting an old stove, somebody's old propane stove that they're getting rid of, that you can just grab for cheap. Now, I know right now with how things are, this might be a bit of a shot in the dark because right now you can't hardly find appliances anywhere brand new. And so most people aren't getting rid of older appliances. But if you are able to get an older propane appliance or even an electric appliance, and definitely not a glass top stove, but my preference is the propane. But if you can get an older electric one, certainly consider that. That may be a better fit than trying to get a portable unit like a Camp Chef or some type of a tabletop unit. But whatever you get, definitely look at the BTUs of the burners. And if it's way too high, don't even consider it. It has to be something that you can regulate down to at least maybe 10,000, at the most 12,000 BTUs. And the caveat to that is make sure that you read your manufacturer's instructions before you do any of this. All right, folks, that's it for this week. I hope you found it helpful. Any questions, reach out to me, Brian at thehomesteadjourney.net.
Brian can be reached by emailing him at brian@thehomesteadjourney.net or by contacting him via our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support this podcast, we invite you to become a member of the Supporting Listeners program. For $10 a month or $100 per year, you will receive access to a community of like-minded individuals via a private Facebook group, at least one monthly live Q&A with Brian, the opportunity to participate in live recordings of the podcast, access to an ever-expanding library of helpful homesteading content, and so much more. Head on over to support.thehomesteadjourney.net for more information and to sign up today. As always, the music on this episode was provided by audionautics.com, so a big shout out to them.
And until next time, everybody, keep up the good work.